Rutland Sheep Hills, Vermont, October 1922. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of coming frost and the smell of wood smoke from 100 chimneys. But at the edge of Werner Amstutz's small, leased pasture, another scent hung in the air, thick and unfamiliar, the greasy animal smell of raw lanolin. Amstutz, a quiet man with the sturdy build of a mountaineer, was methodically stitching enormous, 6-inch thick bats of matted wool to the inside of a surplus WWI Army tent. He used a long needle and heavy waxed thread, his movements precise and unhurried. Chalmers Ledbetter, the Rutland County veterinarian, pulled his Ford Model T to a stop on the rutted track, the engine clattering. He got out. A man whose authority came from his education and his indispensable role in the community's economy. With him was Jedediah Morse, a sheep farmer whose land bordered Amstutz's. They watched for a long moment. "It's a damn foolishness is what it is," Morse grumbled, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Canvas won't stop a Vermont winter. He's building a tomb for his family." Ledbetter, a man of science, was more specific in his critique. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. "Amstutz," he called out, his voice carrying an edge of professional concern. "You pack that much raw wool against canvas, it's going to sweat. Come the first freeze-thaw cycle, you'll have a block of ice. By spring, it will be a rotten, moldering mess. You're building a paradise for moths that could threaten every flock in this valley." Werner Amstutz paused his stitching, looked up, and gave a slight nod. He was not a man for arguments. "The wool will breathe," he said, his Swiss-German accent softening the words. Then he turned back to his work, his needle plunging back into the thick, gray felt. Morse shook his head. "The man's mad," he muttered to Ledbetter, "completely mad." They drove away, leaving Amstutz alone with his strange-smelling tent, a monument to what everyone in the valley saw as immigrant folly. What did this quiet Swiss wool fuller from the high Alps understand about thermal dynamics, moisture wicking, and the very soul of wool that a respected county veterinarian, an expert in animal husbandry, had missed? Before we unpack the science of this remarkable structure, a structure that would soon rewrite the rules of winter survival in these hills, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We explore the forgotten wisdom of the past and the timeless principles of human ingenuity. I promise that by the end of this story, you will not only understand a forgotten building technique, but also the unique physics of natural fibers that modern science is only now rediscovering. And let us know in the comments, have you ever seen an unconventional solution work when all the experts said it couldn't? Werner Amstutz was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer. And he was certainly not a frontiersman in the American sense. He was a Walker Weber from the canton of Uri in Switzerland, a trade as old as the mountains themselves. His hands, calloused and strong, knew the language of wool. They knew the feel of raw fleece, the heft of water-powered trip hammers, the transformation of loose fibers into dense, weather-defying walkstuff. A fulled wool felt so tight it could turn away a blade. In the old country, his family had for generations lined the high-altitude chalets with this material, creating warm, dry sanctuaries against the crushing alpine winters. He understood that a building wasn't just a barrier against the cold. It was a membrane that had to interact with it, to breathe with it. He had arrived in Vermont with his wife, Elspeth, and their 2 small children, Ulrich and Verena, with dreams of raising sheep in hills that reminded him of home. But their first winter, the winter of 1921, had been a brutal education in the failures of conventional American building. They had rented a small, hastily built clapboard shack, a structure that looked solid, but was riddled with 1,000 invisible cracks. The wind, a constant whining presence, found everyone. That winter, The cold had been a thief. It stole their comfort, their peace, and their meager savings. It was a winter defined by a litany of small, miserable failures. The neighbor's new Model T, a symbol of prosperity, sat useless after its water jacket cracked on the first hard freeze. Inside their own pantry, Elspeth's carefully canned blueberry preserves, a taste of summer meant to brighten the dark months, had frozen and burst their glass jars, leaving a purple, crystalline mess on the shelves. The most vivid memory for Werner was a simple woolen sock he'd left hanging on a nail on the shed door. In the morning, it was frozen solid, bent into the permanent mocking shape of a hook. The cold didn't just chill, it transformed, it broke, it defeated. He vowed his family would not endure another winter like that. He could not afford to build a proper house of stone and timber, not yet. But he had his skill, and the hills of Rutland were filled with sheep. The problem in Vermont wasn't just the low temperatures. The problem was the insidious combination of wind, humidity, and poor construction. The standard frontier cabin or farmhouse was a testament to speed and readily available materials, namely wood. A single plank wall offered an R value of perhaps 2, maybe 3 if it was well caulked. But over time the wood shrank, the caulk failed, and the house became a sieve. Air infiltration was the true enemy. A candle flame would bend and dance in a draft you couldn't even feel. Every cubic foot of 0-degree air that leaked in had to be heated to 60 degrees by the stove, an endless, losing battle that consumed cords of wood at an astonishing rate. Jedediah Morse's farmhouse was a perfect example. It was a sturdy, respectable building, but it was a creature of its construction. On a cold night, the inside of the north-facing wall would be coated in a fine layer of frost. Ice crystals grew in the corners of the window panes. His wife and children lived in a small radius around the cast-iron stove, the only truly warm space in the entire house. Moving more than 10 feet from it felt like stepping into a different climate zone. They burned through a cord of hardwood every 10 days, a constant labor of felling, splitting, and hauling that left Jedediah exhausted and his woodlot diminished. Their lives were dictated by the stove's relentless appetite. A bare canvas tent, of course, was considered a joke. With an R value of 0.5, it offered protection from wind and snow, but almost none from the cold. The moment the sun went down, the temperature inside would plummet to match the temperature outside. To survive a winter in one was unthinkable. It was against this backdrop of accepted knowledge, of hard-won and bitter experience, that Werner Amstutz began his work. He wasn't ignoring the local wisdom. He was operating from a different library of it entirely. The project began not with wood, but with water. Werner found a small, swift-running creek on his property, and using lumber and salvaged parts, constructed a simple, water-powered trip hammer. It was a crude version of the great fulling mills of his homeland, but the principle was the same. He then purchased hundreds of pounds of raw, greasy fleece from his neighbors. This wasn't the fine merino wool destined for expensive garments. This was the coarse, strong wool from the sheep's back and belly, sold for pennies a pound for carpet making or insulation. To the local farmers, it was a low-value byproduct. To Werner, it was gold. He and Elspeth spent weeks washing the fleece in the cold creek water, then laying it out in thick, overlapping layers. He channeled water to his trip hammer, and for days the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the wooden mallet echoed through the small valley. The hammer pounded the wet wool, compressing the fibers, tangling their microscopic scales until they locked together into a single, inseparable mass. This was the ancient process of fulling, turning loose fiber into a dense, structural felt, the walkstaff. While the wool was drying, he erected the tent. It was a standard 16 by 20-foot military surplus wall tent, its canvas stained and weathered but still sound. He built a simple but strong ridgepole frame from locally milled pine, ensuring it could bear a heavy snow load. He laid a platform of rough-sawn planks for a floor. Once the wool was dried into enormous 6-inch thick bats, the real work began. Starting at the floor, he meticulously pinned the bats to the inside of the canvas walls. He used long, heavy-duty blanket pins and then stitched the seams between the bats with his waxed thread, creating a continuous, unbroken envelope of wool. There were no gaps, no drafts. He lined the entire tent right up to the eaves. For the floor, he laid down a separate 3-inch thick wool mat, just as dense as the walls. Finally, in the center, he installed a small, efficient cast-iron potbelly stove, its flue rising through a carefully insulated metal collar in the canvas roof. By mid-November, it was done. From the outside, it was just an old army tent. From the inside, it was a soft, gray, quiet room, insulated from the world by the fleece of 100 sheep. The air was still and smelled faintly of lanolin. It was during this final stage that Chalmers Ledbetter returned, this time with a man from the County Agricultural Extension Office. The veterinarian's face was grim. He had lodged a formal complaint. "Amstutz, I warned you," Ledbetter said, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "The state wool inventory tax roll depends on healthy flocks. You've created an ideal breeding ground for textile pests, moths, carpet beetles, and packing untreated organic fiber directly against a canvas vapor barrier is agricultural malpractice. That wool will get damp from condensation, it will not dry, and it will rot. The spores from that rot can cause respiratory illness in your children and your livestock. I'm citing you officially. This structure is a potential threat to the public health of this county's sheep industry." Werner listened patiently, his hands resting on a bat of wool. The texture was dense and slightly oily. He looked the veterinarian in the eye. His response was quiet, not defensive, a simple statement of a principle he knew to be true. "The wool knows how to breathe, Mr. Ledbetter," he repeated. "The lanolin is its own protection. It will not rot. It will stay dry." The extension agent made his notes. The citation was issued. Werner Amstutz was now not just a fool in the eyes of his neighbors, but an officially documented one. To understand why Werner was so confident and Ledbetter, the man of science, was so wrong, you have to understand the extraordinary physics of wool. What the veterinarian saw was a pile of organic fiber. What Werner saw was a high-performance insulation system perfected by millions of years of evolution. Let's start with the numbers. The R value of a material measures its resistance to heat flow. The higher the number, the better the insulation. The thin, wind-battered canvas of the army tent had an R value of about 0.5. It was thermally transparent. In contrast, the 6-inch thick bats of densely fulled wool Werner had created had an R value of approximately R3 per inch. Multiplied by 6 inches, that gave his walls an R value of 18. The canvas outer shell added another 0.5, bringing the total to R18.5. For comparison, a typical 6-inch thick wall of a hastily built plank house might have an R value of 4 or 5. A 12-inch thick sod wall, a well-known frontier insulator, clocked in around R9. Werner's tent wall, at a quarter of the weight, offered double the insulation of a sod house. But the R value was only half the story. The true genius of the system, the part that Ledbetter's formal education had missed, was its ability to manage moisture. This was the key to everything. Every human body, every pot of boiling water, every breath exhaled releases water vapor into the air. In a conventional, poorly insulated house, this warm, moist air hits the cold interior surface of the walls and windows. The temperature of the air drops below its dew point, and the vapor condenses into liquid water, manifesting as frost, ice, or a clammy dampness that chills the bones and invites mold and rot. This is precisely what Ledbetter predicted would happen between the wool and the canvas. But wool is not a passive material like wood or glass. A wool fiber is a complex structure. Its outer surface is covered in tiny, overlapping scales, making it hydrophobic. It repels liquid water. The core of the fiber, however, is hydrophilic. It actively attracts and absorbs water vapor. A wool fiber can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in moisture vapor without feeling wet to the touch, and crucially, without losing its insulating properties. The millions of tiny air pockets trapped within the fulled wool, which are what actually provide the R value, remain intact and full of dry, still air. Werner's tent was a dynamic system. The gentle heat from the potbelly stove created a slight positive pressure inside. This warm, moist air migrated outwards through the wool wall. The wool fibers absorbed the vapor, passed it from fiber to fiber, and transported it to the colder canvas outer layer. The canvas, while waterproof against rain, was still permeable to vapor. The moisture passed harmlessly through the canvas into the dry outer air. The wool acted as a buffer and a conduit, constantly wicking moisture out of the living space, keeping the interior of the tent bone dry. Far from rotting, the wool was protecting the entire structure. The natural lanolin oil, left in the wool, was a powerful antimicrobial and a natural moth repellent. The system was perfect. It was a sheep's fleece, writ large. That December, winter came to the Green Mountains not with a blizzard, but with a silent, crystalline cold. A high-pressure system settled over New England, bringing 12 consecutive nights of perfectly clear skies. Without a blanket of clouds to hold in the Earth's warmth, temperatures plunged under the vast, starry expanse. This was a radiative freeze. The cold air, dense and heavy, drained down the hillsides and pooled in the valleys, settling in for a long, brutal stay. For 12 straight nights, the thermometer outside Jedediah Morse's farmhouse read 34 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no fresh snow to provide a layer of insulation. The frozen ground was as hard as iron. For the Morse family, it was a siege. The well pump froze solid, requiring them to haul water from the creek. The woodpile seemed to vanish before their eyes. The stove roared day and night, yet the house was never truly warm. The children, bundled in coats and hats, had perpetual coughs. Life shrank to the few feet of habitable space around the stove. One morning, Jedediah found a pail of milk he'd left just inside the kitchen door frozen solid. It was a life of shivering, constant labor, and gnawing anxiety. At the Amstutz tent, life was different. The small potbelly stove consumed a surprisingly small amount of wood, glowing with a steady, moderate heat. Inside the wool-lined space, the temperature held at a consistent, comfortable 70 degrees. The contrast was not just measurable, it was visible in the small details of domestic life. At the Morse farm, a dipper of water left on a table would develop a skin of ice in 20 minutes. Inside Werner's tent, Elsbeth was able to proof bread dough. She would mix the flour, water, and yeast in a simple wooden bowl and leave it on the small table far from the direct heat of the stove. In the gentle, pervasive warmth, the yeast would slowly, reliably activate, the dough rising under a clean linen cloth. It was an act of profound, quiet normalcy, an everyday miracle made possible by 6 inches of wool. The sound inside was different too. The howling wind was a distant whisper, the thick wool dampening the noise to a gentle hum. It was a pocket of calm carved out of the heart of the winter. But the most definitive proof sat on a simple wooden shelf Werner had built against one of the wool-lined walls. It was a large, 20-pound wheel of Sprins, a hard-aged cheese from his home canton, a gift from relatives. This cheese was a living thing. Its complex flavors depended on stable temperature and humidity. In the Morse's pantry, a similar block of Vermont cheddar, a winter staple, had succumbed to the fluctuating temperatures. The cold had leached the moisture from it, cracking its surface and turning its texture to a dry yellow flint, almost tasteless. But on Werner's shelf, the sprints remained perfect. Its rind was firm and unbroken, and when Elsbeth cut a wedge for the evening meal, the cheese inside was creamy, nutty, and vibrant. The cheese, like the family, was thriving. It was the ultimate silent testament to the success of the breathing wall. On the 10th night of the deep freeze, Chalmers Ledbetter was making his rounds. It was a grim business. He was checking on a prize bull that was struggling with pneumonia, and he knew of 3 farms that had lost newborn calves. The air was so cold it felt like a physical weight, stinging his lungs with every breath. His motorized rig, a converted truck chassis he used for his veterinary calls, chugged along the frozen, rutted road, its engine block wrapped in blankets. As he passed the turnoff to the Amstutz place, there was a sharp crack, a lurch, and the vehicle ground to a halt. He got out, his breath pluming in the frigid air. A quick inspection revealed the problem. The cotter pin on the front wheel hub had been made brittle by the cold and had sheared off. The wheel was askew, the entire rig disabled. The farrier, Silas Prentice, was a good 5 miles away, and Ledbetter knew that at 35 below zero, a 5-mile walk was a life-threatening gamble. He was in serious trouble. His face was already numb, and a painful ache was settling deep into his fingers and toes. Then, through the skeletal trees, he saw it. A faint, warm glow from the strange canvas tent on the hill. Swallowing his professional pride and his personal skepticism was easier than freezing to death. He trudged up the slight incline, his boots squeaking on the crystalline snow. He reached the simple flap door and hesitated for only a second before pulling it aside. He braced himself for what he expected to find: a blast of frigid, damp, sheep-smelling air, a family huddled in misery around a dangerously hot stove. He expected to see his own breath fog in the air inside. The reality was a physical shock. He stepped through the flap not into a cold, damp space, but into a calm, dry, and utterly astonishing warmth. The air was still. It smelled faintly of lanolin and yeast. The potbelly stove was glowing a gentle cherry red, not roaring white hot. And across the room, the 2 Amstutz children, Ulrich and Verena, were sitting on the thick wool floor mat in their shirt sleeves, quietly playing with a set of small carved wooden animals. Elsbeth looked up from her knitting and smiled a welcome. The intense, biting pain in Ledbetter's ears, a sure sign of encroaching frostbite, began to subside almost immediately, replaced by a warm, prickling tingle. He was wearing a thick muskrat fur cap, tied down over his ears. Without thinking, his gloved hand went up and untied the flaps. He pulled the cap off, his head suddenly feeling too hot. He just stood there, holding his hat, staring. He ran a hand over the interior wall. He expected to feel a cold, clammy surface. It was warm, and it was completely, impossibly dry. Werner offered him the use of their party line telephone to call the farrier. Ledbetter, his voice uncharacteristically subdued, made the call. While he waited, he walked the small space, his scientific mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him with what his training dictated. He saw the wheel of sprins on the shelf, perfectly intact. He saw the rising bread dough on the table. He saw healthy, comfortable children playing on a warm floor. Finally, he turned to Werner, his expression one of pure, unadulterated astonishment. He looked from the simple stove to the thick wool walls and back to the quiet Swiss man. "My God, Amstutz," Ledbetter said, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought you were building a death trap. I cited you." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't build a house. You built the flock's winter coat. Chalmers Ledbetter's conversion was total and immediate. The next day, after the farrier had repaired his rig, he drove directly to the county extension office and personally withdrew his complaint. He then became the wool tent's most vocal and credible advocate. He spoke of it at the Grange Hall. He described it to his fellow veterinarians, men who, like him, understood the properties of animal fiber. His endorsement, coming from the man who had been the most articulate critic, carried immense weight. The story spread most quickly through Rutland's small but tight-knit Swiss-American community. At the next meeting of the Grütli Verein von Rutland, the local Swiss cultural society, Ledbetter stood up and gave a detailed scientific account of what he had witnessed. Werner, coaxed by his friends, then quietly explained the principles of the Walkstoff lining. The Society's next monthly bulletin, printed in March of 1923, featured a page of simple, hand-drawn diagrams by Werner, showing exactly how to cut, full, and attach the wool bats. The adoption was not immediate or widespread among the general population. The idea was still too strange for many, but within the Swiss-American community, it took root. By the following autumn, 5 other families, most of them connected to veterinary medicine or large-scale sheep farming, had built their own wool-lined structures. They used them for workshops, for lambing sheds, and in 2 cases, as temporary housing for hired hands. The results were identical to Werner's. They reported astonishing fuel savings, averaging a 60% reduction in wood consumption and unparalleled levels of dry, comfortable warmth. Werner Amstutz's folly had become a proven, repeatable piece of engineering. What Werner had done, using ancient knowledge and simple materials, was create a high-performance building envelope that was decades ahead of its time. His system anticipated many of the core principles of modern building science. The thick Walkstoff was, in effect, a precursor to modern mineral wool or fiberglass bat insulation, but with superior moisture handling capabilities. The combination of the wool interior and the canvas exterior created a system remarkably similar to a modern house with interior insulation and a vapor-permeable exterior building wrap like Tyvek or Gore-Tex. Werner Amstutz, the Swiss wool fuller, understood instinctively what engineers would spend the next 50 years proving with complex formulas and expensive laboratory equipment, that a building must be able to breathe. It must manage moisture vapor to remain warm, dry, and healthy. The Vermont frontier was a landscape that did not reward theories, credentials, or eloquent arguments. It rewarded what worked. The men who had mocked Werner Amstutz weren't malicious or ignorant. They were practical men working from a deep well of proven, hard-won experience. But their experience was with wood, stone, and iron, materials that fight the cold with brute force and thermal mass. Their entire philosophy was to build an impenetrable fortress against the winter. Werner came from a different tradition, born in mountains so high and winters so fierce that fortresses were not enough. His tradition was one of adaptation, of working with the elements, not just against them. He saw the winter not as an enemy to be walled out, but as a condition to be managed. He understood in a way his neighbors could not, that the very thing that kept a sheep alive and warm through a blizzard at 10,000 feet, its remarkable breathing fleece, could do the same for his family in a Vermont valley. He didn't build a house against winter. He wrapped his family in the flock's coat and stitched it to the tent. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more content like this. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other natural materials hold surprising scientific properties that we've overlooked? Your engagement helps us continue to share these important stories. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only, based on historically inspired reconstructions. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.